KennyS. He was absolute fucking god mode.
No way, Kenny! You gotta stop! Take it away from him. There's no way to shut him down. KennyS now has to try and clutch it. Missed the first shot. Does hit stand immediately after. He's got a smoke. He's on the defuse. It's 5 HP versus 1, and Kenny gets aggressive.
Give this man the op, and he will get results.
KennyS is one of the most well-known players in the history of gaming. You didn't have to watch or play Counter-Strike to know his name, or see his insane highlights.
Really important round right here. They need to go big, and Kenny's gonna go ahead peek in a second. And he gets the flick on his Zipnix, lightning fast.
His peak is one that still remains one of the hardest to match, with only a few players ever reaching that level in the almost 10 years of CSGO. Kenny was easily one of the flashiest players in the world, and he defined the awper role in an era where we saw multiple all-time greats use the weapon. He exuded confidence. His aggressive playstyle can only work if you had his God-given talents. His opponents knew that he would repeat in angles, and still Kenny would always find a way to win the fight. He was faster, more accurate, and simply better than his competition. With his pro career having been on pause for a year now, it seems like a good time to go in depth about his illustrious career. The beginning of CSGO was not kind to many professionals of Source in 1.6. But the young Frenchman quickly became one of the game's rising stars. He began his career with the prestigious Very Games lineup, one that consisted of other legendary names in the French scene. Yet, one thing was for certain. The 18-year-old awper was not going to be outshined.
Teams went for this push into upper there.
Gets it, and now it's only KennyS remaining. Huge headshot onto Kenny. Oh my god, what's going on in this little Frenchman's head?
They're about to run directly into each other. Kenny gonna pick up the advantage and able to take.
The young Frenchman, actually only 17 years of age, has just exploded my mind there.
Counter-Strike in 2013 had 3 tiers of teams: NIP, Very Games, and everyone else. During NIP's still unmatched run of 87-0, the only team that really seemed like they could consistently compete on the same level as them was KennyS's Very Games roster. The highlight of KennyS's Very Games career was an MVP performance at Mad Catz Birmingham. This event firmly put him on the map as one of the best awpers in CSGO early on. At just 18 years of age, Kenny was consistently helping prop Very Games to many top 3 finishes. However, they were only able to win 1 trophy, ultimately making the team's accomplishments not representative of their skill set on paper. Therefore, Kenny was replaced after a disappointing ESCA Season 13 finals. The reasoning? His quote, lack of progression, and the fact that he didn't make sufficient efforts to help the team. Kenny would bounce around a little bit after the Very Games demotion, seeing him spend time on LDLC and Recursive to end the year. Overall, even with the ups and downs of the year, Kenny was still rated the 12th best player of 2013 by HLTV. When we think of KennyS, many will think of 2014's version. Although he didn't achieve much team success, performance-wise, it was one of his best years. The peak he hit in 2014 is something many awpers can never dream of.
Fast pushes from Titan have been called and found out, but there's KennyS with 2 and a 3rd as well, and a 4th. Unbelievable play from Kenny, and he gets the ace.
KennyS joined Titan in early 2014, reuniting him with many former teammates in Very Games. One thing was clear: he finally believed he was ready to be the guy on the team. He had big shoes to fill, replacing another all-time great in Shocks. But Kenny made a statement in his first event with the team. Star Series 9 Finals in Ukraine was a 4-team event which also included legendary teams NIP, Virtus.pro, and Na'Vi. A big challenge awaited Kenny, but he put on a show during this event. Titan defeated VP 2-0, with KennyS having a massive 54 kill performance. Although the team ended up finishing 3rd overall, Kenny ended the event with a 1.5 rating, good for 3rd across the entire tournament. The next event was DreamHack Summer. KennyS needed to build upon a good showing in Ukraine, and he did just that. Kenny would carry his team to a quarterfinal finish with an amazing 1.35 rating across the event, by far the best for his team. Kenny and crew would have made another step in the right direction at their next event, Gfinity 3. An important event before the major, Titan made the CS world respect them with a second place finish. Kenny put on monster performances against many top teams, including Fnatic, awper, and VP. This event was his second straight with above a 1.3 rating. It proved the notion that KennyS, when on form, was an absolute highlight machine. Cologne had arrived. It was time for the French to face and defeat their demons. This core of players had failed to meet expectations at each of the two majors before. And with emerging French teams like LDLC and Epsilon, it was time for Titan to prove that they were the class of the region. They were placed in what seemed like a favorable group. However, once again, KennyS was on the wrong side of history. In their opening game, Titan faced off against Cloud9. The Americans were always a wild card, but after a few successful events for Titan, on paper, this should have been a win. It wasn't. A brutal overtime affair between the two ended with a 22-18 win for the Americans. And although a 36-27 effort from the superstar awper, KennyS was facing elimination once again in the major. In the Elim match, Kenny showed no mercy to the Australians. He had a masterful 26 kills in just 17 rounds, ending with an unthinkable 2.32 rating. Titan had secured one more chance. Kenny had secured one more chance. All he had to do was defeat Dignitas to reach the major playoffs for the first time in his career. On paper, this team should have had a competitive bout, and a player of KennyS's caliber could have been the X factor. However, that's not what happened. Dignitas embarrassed Titan to the tune of a 16-1 scoreline, and Kenny, a player who had seemed immune to putting up poor performances, only had 4 kills. Changes had to be made after that humbling performance at Cologne. The first French shuffle had arrived. Each of those 3 teams mentioned earlier were involved in this massive player swap. KennyS, a franchise player at this point, was safe on Titan, but his teammates weren't. Titan added Apex, Kaylee, and Maniac from the upstart LDLC team. This seemed like it could be the boost KennyS needed. Apex and Kaylee looked to be a much needed firepower upgrades for the team, and it was. The first event with this team was KennyS's first event win in a calendar year. DreamHack Stockholm was KennyS's and Titan's proving ground. Kenny, once again, achieved his trademark 1.3 HLTV rating at the event. In a head-to-head matchup with another great awper in JW, Kenny stood out with a 1.55 rating. This led to a grand final clash between KennyS and his former teammates in LDLC. The Frenchman showed no mercy against them, finishing as a top fragger in a 2-0 win, proving that Titan are the kings of France once again. Titan, however, would be the victim of inconsistency, something that couldn't be said about KennyS's individual performances. Titan struggled in the next 3 events to close out the year. Finishing 3rd out of 4 teams in Star Series 10, Kenny, like always, was a monster, finishing with the 5th best rating at the event. His next closest teammate had a nearly 20-point difference. During a pivotal ESWC on home soil, Titan failed to meet all expectations, but only finishing in the quarterfinals. Once again losing the LDLC, making it clear that KennyS was once again on the wrong side of a French shuffle. The next event was supposed to be KennyS's 4th major, DreamHack Counter, a chance to prove himself on the biggest stage. However, Titan's 2nd best player, Kaylee, was handed his now infamous VAC ban, meaning that his Titan teammates were also disqualified from the event. This was a massive blow, not only in the short term by missing the major, but long term by removing one of the few stars Kenny had on his team. The final event in 2014 was ESCA 17 finals. Titan finished in 5th to 6th place, but only 8 teams attended the event. Titan were eliminated by iBuyPower, even with a godly 76 kill performance by Kenny. It wasn't enough. This event was a culmination of a worrying trend for Kenny. Standout performance after standout performance, with little wins to show for it. To put it in perspective how good Kenny was at this event, look at this. Kenny's rating and the next closest. It was the definition of a hard carry. The Titan team simply lacked firepower with the loss of Kaylee. The future looked bleak for this iteration of Titan, and the question started looming. Was KennyS's prime going to be wasted? Kenny was rated the 6th best player in 2014 according to HLTV's annual list, a ranking that surely would have been higher if he had just had the team accomplishments that lined up with his amazing play. All in all, 2014 was the year that cemented KennyS as a superstar. "2015 was a tale of two halves for KennyS. One left us wanting more, and the other gave us everything we ever wanted to see from the Frenchman. In the first half of 2015, Kenny was still struggling to figure out how to make his Titan lineup work. They would have decent results to start the year, albeit at smaller events. They would have 2 back-to-back runner-up finishes, with KennyS putting up godlike MVP-worthy statistics. He was clearly the best awper in the world at this point, with only Guardian coming close. Once again, it was time to put his money where his mouth was. The 5th CSGO major had arrived, and at this point, the trend of Kenny failing to meet expectations had really become noticeable. ESL won Katowice 2015. It's a time to put those doubters to bed. Unfortunately, once again, he was on the wrong side of history. In what seemed like fate, his Titan team faced Envious in the opening round. Kenny would have to prove against his former teammates and reigning major winners that he was the king of France. Unfortunately, his 22 kill effort wasn't enough, as Titan barely lost 16 to 14. However, Titan competed with the best team in the world. That's encouraging, right? Well, maybe not, because in their elimination game, they faced the German underdogs Penta. Titan were massive favorites here. Penta had just gotten demolished by LGB, and yet somehow, KennyS found himself on the wrong side of an embarrassing 16-4 scoreline. Meaning for the 4th straight time, KennyS was eliminated in the group stage of a major. This time he couldn't really even blame his teammates. Although he did have the best performance from his team, he only sported a .92 rating, his worst ever at a LAN since 2013. Things didn't get much better for KennyS. Although he still clearly was the best player on Titan, his team wasn't getting better. And then, Val seemingly added onto the list of problems for the Op God. They nerfed the sniper into oblivion. The gun had now been made to be more difficult to use while moving. It was slower to move while scoped in, hamstringing aggressive oppers like Kenny. The op nerf clearly impacted Kenny. He was never bad after this change, but he started to show more inconsistencies than ever before. As Titan were struggling, so was Kenny. He had multiple mediocre events, with ratings falling into the low 1.0s. But time was running out for Kenny and this Titan lineup. The writing was on the wall that another French shovel was coming. A bombshell report was released by HLTV, claiming that KennyS, alongside with his teammate Apex, were headed to the North American organization. KennyS will once again have a chance to play with France's best players. On paper, a super team was formed. This team was poised to take Counter-Strike by storm, and they did. Envy's first event was a roaring success at IEM Gamescom. Envy would work their way to the finals to face TSM, who were coming into the event as the odds-on favorite. That didn't stop Kenny from destroying them at map 1, putting up a vintage 20-9 performance. He would follow that up on Cobblestone with a 22-12 showing, and even embarrass the crap out of Kerrigan with his classic clip.
He doesn't have like any time to work with. The bomb pass can take 5 seconds alone. He's gonna go for it behind the fountain. Kerrigan just gonna charge him down. He's gonna miss quite a few pistol shots. KennyS, he picks up the kill! Kerrigan should not have, but then he gets the second! finishes the round.
Kenny would win his first event in almost a year, and more importantly, he was once again showing the confidence that he had pre-awper. All signs pointed to ESL 1 Cologne 2015 being the major where Kenny finally broke his major curse. He had the team, he had the confidence, and Envy were placed in Group B. On paper, it was quite the favorable group. This was KennyS's best chance to see the major playoffs, and he didn't let it go to waste. Kenny and crew dominated Flipside, earning them an important early win. Kenny finished with an insane 1.68 rating, hitting some of the nastiest shots you'll ever see. In Game 2, Kenny and Envy faced LG. Kenny had a real challenge with Fallen in the op duel, just narrowly winning the head-to-head battle 7 kills to 5. Kenny would finish overall with 28 kills in the match, and although LG gave them a scare, it was Envy who booked their place to the Lanxess Arena. Envy would have to face the ever-dangerous Na'Vi in the first round. The stage was set for a Guardian and KennyS clash to show who the best awper in CS really was. On map 1, Envy seemed to have won every pivotal clutch, and Kenny was at the forefront, winning one of the most unusual clutches in CS history. And of course, it was against Guardian.
Straight in his face, doesn't hit the no-scope, doesn't hit the pistol. Oh, KennyS, would you believe it?
In map 2, they dominated the T side, much in part to KennyS's 11-3 KD ratio. He carried his team in that half to win the game 16-10, and the match 2-0. In a statement game against Guardian, Kenny won the head-to-head, making it clear that these two legends were neck and neck in the conversation of the best awper in the world. Moving on to the semis, it didn't seem to get any easier for Envy, as they had to face TSM, the tournament favorites. Kenny would not fare well against the Danish super team, performing the worst out of the entire 10-player server. He would finish with a measly 0.78 rating across 3 maps. However, unlike his previous teams, Envy wasn't a one-man squad, and could prevail even if Kenny had an odd game off. NBK was the one who carried Envy to a 2-1 win and booked a place in the grand finals against Fnatic. Dust 2 between these two teams was electric. It was back and forth, with both teams having 10-5 halves, leading into overtime. Unfortunately, KennyS did not show up. Dust 2 was historically his best map, but the worrying trends from the semi-final continued, as Kenny was playing average with just 22 kills in 34 rounds and a 0.96 rating. Cobblestone was a chance for redemption. However, the Swedes were simply too much to handle. Kenny had what might be his single worst performance of his entire career. He finished with a 4-19 scoreline and was invisible on the biggest stage. Envious crashed out 2-0 in a disappointing final. Overall, Kenny finished with an awful 0.94 rating in the event. Real questions were circulating. Was Kenny a choker? Or was he simply inexperienced in the biggest matches? Kenny used the remainder of the year to shut his critics up. He won his first MVP with Envy and his second event at DreamHack London. He was back to his old shenanigans with wrist-breaking flicks and god-tier multi-kills. At this event, he once again proved he was the kryptonite for TSM. In the finals, he dominated with a 1.37 rating and humbled the Danes in the process. This would be the first of 3 straight event wins for Envy, and Kenny achieved sustained success for the first time in his career. The third event of that streak was DreamHack Cluj-Napoca, the final major of the year. And this time, Kenny and Envious were the odds-on favorites, and you feeling for the awper. All eyes were on him to put the choking reputation to bed. And he did just that. Envy dominated their group, winning 2 best of ones against Dignitas and Na'Vi in convincing fashion. In the latter match, Kenny once again won the op duel against Guardian, proving he may just be the better player. The playoffs had reached, and this time Kenny had no easy feat, as it was a rematch of the Cologne finals between Envy and Fnatic in what seemed as a cruel joke. One of the favorites was going to be sent home early. The pressure was on, and boy did Kenny deliver when it mattered. Fnatic won the opening map, and it looked like Envy were once again going to disappoint at the major. But in map 2, Kenny turned it on, with an awesome 23-13 game, demolishing his op rival and JW in the process. The Frenchmen won the map and did not look back, with an unthinkable 16-2 win against Fnatic in map 3, sending them home. In the semis, G2 would upset Envy on KennyS's home map of Dust 2. And once again, the Frenchmen were on the heels of defeat. On came Inferno, and what is in my opinion, the top 10 maps in CSGO history, Envy barely prevailed. Like Inferno always is, a back and forth game commenced, with Envy being in the clutches of defeat multiple times. But Kenny dragged his team, particularly through the T sides, with opening kills and multi-frags. After a 25-21 win on Inferno, G2 were no match for Envious in map 3, as KennyS put on a clinic, ending with a plus 13 KD ratio. The stage was set for another Guardian and KennyS matchup, this time in the grand finals of a major. One of these two legends was going to finally break through and win their first major trophy. The first map could have gone either way, as the teams traded rounds back and forth, but it was Kenny who made a statement with a 1.46 rating and 26 kills, leading his team to a narrow 16-14 win. To put into comparison, his nearest teammate in that map had a 0.83 rating. This was a classic KennyS hard carry. He wasn't shying away from the spotlight like in Cologne, and that continued in map 2. This time, in dominant fashion, KennyS humbled Guardian and proved to the world that he was the best awper in counterstrike.
And now it's a 1 versus 1, AWP versus AWP, Kenny versus Guardian, and this could be a huge round for either player. And Kenny, he steals it away, it doesn't even matter.
And in turn, achieved what every player dreams of. He won his first major and was on top of the Counter-Strike world. In addition, he also won his first major MVP with a 1.23 rating across the event, by far the best on his team. Like the old days, Kenny carried his team. Unlike the old days, it actually resulted in a trophy. 2015 was the year that Kenny finally broke out. He finally had a team to support him, and for the first time, he was on the world's best team. He was finally on the right side of the French shuffle. Kenny won 4 trophies and 3 MVPs, while being ranked as the 6th best player in the world by HLTV. He was the best T-side player in Counter-Strike, and one of the best at opening rounds. 2015 Kenny showed just how important confidence was, because when he had it, there was no player in Counter-Strike who could stop him.
2016 was the year of the same old story for KennyS. The success that he found in the latter half of 2015 was slowly fading. His team was unraveling at the seams, and once again, he was the best player on a disappointing roster. The first 3 months of the year were okay at best. Envy finished with a 3rd and 4th place finish at their first event, losing to Na'Vi. Guardian dominated Kenny, which was the exact opposite of what happened in 2015. However, their next event was a different story. Kenny was back to his same old self, with an MVP performance at GEC 2016. Envy won the smaller event, dismantling the newfound Australis and Dignitas at back-to-back electric performances. A 1.3 impact rating made it clear that he was simply too hot to handle during this event. However, Envy failed to gain momentum. At ESL Barcelona, they finished 5th place out of 8 teams. This was the warm-up event for Katowice, and Envy's performance did not instill any confidence in the French side. Now came a pivotal IEM Katowice. Envy needed to perform here, however they bombed and finished in 2nd to last place, just barely winning 1 out of their 6 matches. Kenny had another poor event with a .987 rating. It seemed like he was being left behind. Other op stars like Guardian, JW, and Device were all achieving more success with their team and individual wise. Add in the emergence of Fallen as a real star, and Kenny was beginning to lose his place among the truly elite. Something needed to change. Envious and Ori couldn't wait for things to turn around anymore. They saw what we all saw. This team was done. Instead of another iteration of the French shuffle, Envy looked to add in some younger talent instead of recycling players. Unfortunately, France wasn't the deepest region outside of the 2 top teams. LDLC was the next best, and Envy chose Devil out of that 5. Simply put, this didn't solve anything for the French side. The slow decline continued, The trajectory that they were headed on led to them being no longer in title contention. They did not receive a direct invite to MLG Columbus, the first major of 2016, and first with the new roster. Expectations were already low, and yet somehow, Envy managed to disappoint anyways.
Back into him, leave it to Happy to find the refrag, but it's a Dren to close it out, and Envious are done. Gambit lives on.
Unbelievable, that's it. Envious have been knocked out of the major, the current champions. Going home in the group stage is to Gambit Gaming.
Not only did the defending major champions not make the playoffs, they were eliminated in last place. Facing CLG and Gambit, two mediocre sides, they only mustered a combined 21 rounds in 2 maps. Shockingly, KennyS was the 7th worst player in the entire event, with a dreadful .72 rating, his worst of all time. Even during his time in Titan, when he had a struggling team, he was able to consistently put on great performances. However, this time, Kenny was one of the main reasons why his team was struggling. He was a star, he had everything set up for him, and yet he still struggled. A player like Kenny was always so dynamic because his confidence was sky high. But during this period, Kenny was visibly dejected. His confidence was gone, and it was showing in game. He did have a bounce back performance at DreamHack Masters Momo. At this big event, Envy would make a run to the semifinals, once again losing to the rivals Na'Vi and Guardian. Along the way, Kenny had one of his best games of all time. A 1.78 match rating and a dominant 2-0 win versus Dignitas. He was simply electric, winning every clutch he was in. This was a glimpse of a vintage Kenny we hadn't seen in months. He was still in there somehow and just needed to be unleashed. The middle of 2016 was the same old story for KennyS. His consistency was back to elite levels, not falling below a 1.1 rating for 7 straight events. He was a bright spot on a team that could not muster up more than a quarterfinals finish. They once again bombed in last place at the major, and although Kenny would have a team-leading 1.13 rating, it wasn't enough to beat a mediocre Mousesports or an unpredictable Liquid. Pro League Season 4 seemed like a spark that Envy needed. They blitzed the group stage with 3 wins and 1 loss. Kenny put on a clinic in almost every one of those matches. On came the quarterfinals against NIP. This one could have gone either way. Both rosters filled with legendary players who had been struggling to find consistency. Unfortunately, despite KennyS's best efforts, NIP would win 2-0. An old familiar story for Kenny, who would end up with a godlike 1.28 rating and only a middling finish to show for it. 2016 ended with more disappointment for KennyS, as he and his team looked destined for more changes. Although the year was not comparable to his previous 2, KennyS still managed to get 13th place in HLTV's ratings. If you looked at his team accomplishments, you would think he wouldn't even be that high, but his individual stats were still pretty amazing. He had the 2nd best opening kill percentage for the year, and performed extremely well in big matches with a 1.15 rating. This was, however, the first year that Kenny really showed that he is human, and may no longer be capable of dragging a team to big finishes. Entering 2017, it was already known that changes were going to be made in the French scene. So the WESG 2016 finals seemed like a formality for KennyS and the Envy boys. However, Kenny did not let that affect his play. He won the MVP of the $1.5 million event, dismantling teams like Space Soldiers and King Yuan. Although the event didn't have the strongest teams, the win still did a lot for his confidence. The next event was the E-League Atlanta Major. Envy already seemed like a dead team at this point, and this event was a formality. However, he was eliminated in 9th to 11th place, just 1 win away from the playoffs, largely in part due to his 1.22 rating, a whopping 16 points better than anybody else on his squad. In March of 2017, KennyS's fortunes would be changed. A French shuffle had commenced. A new lineup, the best of both G2 and Envy, would form, featuring the long-awaited team-up of France's biggest stars, KennyS and Shox. This lineup had probably the most hype out of any team coming out of the offseason, and in the first event they showed glimpses of why. They started Star Series Season 3 finals with 3 convincing wins against top competition. They blitzed NIP in their debut game, and KennyS was the main reason why. His 89 ADR proved way too much for NIP to handle. In G2's second game, they faced ranked number 3 in the world, SK Gaming, and yet G2 embarrassed them on their CT side, to the tune of a 13-2 scoreline. G2 looked like early favorites in their first event. However, they were quickly humbled by FaZe. In a 3-map affair, G2 would be bounced in their first event and finish with a quarterfinal appearance. The slow start continued for the new lineup in GMAC Austin, but they were clearly the favorites, and yet didn't even make the finals. Kenny would still pop off like always, as he was the best player for G2 and earned an EVP performance for his 1.23 rating at the event. Next came a pivotal event for G2, playing on home soil for the first time. GMAC Tours was G2's event to make a statement to the world, and they did just that. After losing their opening game to Tricked, G2 would not look back, winning 4 straight series. And KennyS, for his part, finished the event with amazing 7 straight games above a 1.06 rating, with 6 of those being above 1.28. The guy was in God mode. He was simply too hard to contain for teams like Mouse and Hellraisers, and add in the fact that G2 had all 5 players fragging at any time, made it an event they were destined to win. Here G2 really showed their full potential. No team on paper had firepower like this, and for the first time in 2 years, KennyS finally had a team that could protect him from the odd bad game. They carried this momentum into Pro League Season 5, their biggest event with the new roster. G2 had found the formula to success, and no team here was beating them. G2 topped their group thanks in large part to KennyS's 20-9 stomping of SK, and his dismantling of Fnatic in G2's final group game, with a vintage 30-kill, 1.71 rating performance. He would rematch against SK in the semis. We had one of the best duels of all time, Prime KennyS versus Prime Fallen. In map 1, both awpers would have 25 kills, but it was KennyS who won the head-to-head. Map 2 was a different story, as Kenny had a rare pedestrian game with just a 16-17 scoreline. However, he still won the head-to-head against Fallen 4-3, proving that he was a better awper at the time. G2 made a statement with this win against SK. They were the real deal, and they proved it again in the grand finals against a young North squad. Map 1, it was all Kenny, as he finished with an amazing 31 kills and 104 ADR. Map 2 was a similar story. With 16 kills on Cobble, Kenny and G2 had North on the verge of defeat. North stood no chance against an angry and determined KennyS. G2 were on top of the CS world. KennyS was on top of the CS world. His MVP performance cemented his place right back as the best awper in the world. For the first time in 2 years, KennyS was on the world's best team. That momentum was short-lived, however, as it always seemed to be for French CS. The holes in the team were starting to show. At ESL Cologne, G2 had a fantastic group stage, defeating SK, Immortals, and ZywOo on their way to the playoffs. Kenny was a large reason why. A 1.77 rating against Immortals and a 1.4 rating against SK were amazing to watch, and he carried G2 to easy wins in what should have been difficult ones. The playoffs saw them face a struggling Guardian and Na'Vi. What was once the premier matchup in CSGO. This time, KennyS vs Guardian was supposed to be a cakewalk for Kenny. In a close, nail-biting quarterfinals, G2 would lose 2-0, even with Kenny finishing with 56 kills. Cologne was another standout event for Kenny, as he finished with the second best rating overall at 1.25. At this point, he was the undisputed best awper in the world once again. The PGL Krakow Major was another chance for the Frenchmen to prove their elite status. And once again, they fumbled completely.
You can see the emotion on Kenny's face. He's trying to hold it all in at the moment. That is a brutal way to make your exit.
G2 had a tough group stage, facing 5 top 15 teams in the world. They had 2 wins which were nail-bitingly close, and 3 losses that were stomps. G2 was not competitive at a pivotal major for them. Once again, KennyS was on the other side of the playoffs, when on paper, he should be in contention for the trophy. And this time, KennyS had nobody to blame but himself. This was his worst event of the year. And once again, Kenny would struggle at the major. As someone who rarely had events of a 1 rating or below, this was his 5th out of 11 majors with that glaring red number. G2 was leaking oil. While on paper their team had firepower for days, In the server, it was anything but. Everybody on the team was playing at an all-time low. Kenny was once again the victim of a French region filled with inconsistent stars. G2 decided to hold pat during the player break, making no changes to their lineup, while other struggling teams did. And that decision seemingly paid off. G2 would win DreamHack Malmo in stunning and dominant fashion, not losing a single game. KennyS was unstoppable with the op. He completely eviscerated SK on Mirage, the deciding map of the quarterfinals, once again winning the op duel versus Fallen. Against NIP in the semis, he top fragged for G2 and had a magnificent 34 kills in an OT win on Cash. He was denying any retake and clutch attempts for NIP, and of course had one of the most famous op flicks in CS history.
Very soon.
Oh, that is fast!
In a Grand Finals rematch against North, Kenny put his full power on display. He made Infernal and Cobblestone seem tiny, as he would be everywhere North wanted to go, and ready to shut them down. His fast flicks, insane movement, and versatility were on full display, as G2 easily won the third advantage. KennyS would win his 4th MVP medal of the year, the most any player had at that time. It was too good to be true though, as G2 would fall back into their old habits to finish out the year. At Elite, Premier, and Epicenter, KennyS would have decent performances, but once again G2 would fail to make a splash in the playoffs of any of these events. IEM Oakland was KennyS' last god tier event of 2017. Although G2 had one of their most disappointing events of the year, Kenny was not to blame. In a losing effort against FaZe, Kenny would have an awesome 29 kill game, far and away the best on his team. He would also have a 40 kill performance, including a 27-12 game against Liquid. However, it still wasn't enough, and G2 were going home early once again. 2017 was a year of ups and downs for Kenny. Quite simply, he was the best awper in the world for large stretches, specifically the early 3 or 4 months. However, the emergence of Simple and Fallen showed that newer blood was coming for the crown. Like it always seemed to be for Kenny, he was on a team that was painfully inconsistent. G2 were never able to put together a prolonged stretch of dominance. And once again, he was the hard carry of his team, as Shox' decline was a glaring problem. KennyS' 4 MVPs was the second most of the year out of any player. His 0.79 kills per round meant that he was the 4th best fragger in all of Counter-Strike. Simply put, 2017 was proof that KennyS still had God mode in him, after a disappointing 2016. It was also the final time KennyS won a trophy or an MVP. Prime KennyS was on his way out. 2018 was the year that we first began to see the warning signs that his godlike era-defining awper was starting to lose a step. As newer players were coming into the game, and newer, more utility-defining metas were more prevalent, this was the year that KennyS' downturn was exposed. 2018's E-League Major was a proving grounds for KennyS and G2, as they showed they can at least fight with the big dogs. Kenny performed admirably in both the qualifier and the main stage, with a 1.2 and 1.13 rating respectively. Kenny and G2 would shock the scene, running through their competition in the group stage. They got 3 straight best of 1 wins, advancing them to the playoffs. Kenny, for his part, was electric in each group stage game. The path looked clear for the Frenchman to go on another Cinderella run at the Major. Their first match was Cloud9. The Americans came into this event on a good run of form, but on paper, the lack of big game experience at the Major was a clear disadvantage against the likes of G2. But Cloud9, with the American crowd buzzing in the background, made G2 look like chumps. Kenny once again failed in the playoff match of a Major. This time, he was simply invisible on the CZ side, with only 9 kills in 2 maps on defense. The rest of 2018 was simply mediocre for KennyS' standards. G2 would go on a 4 tournament streak of missing the playoffs, in which Kenny would fail to achieve more than a 1.13 rating. It's clear at this point that Kenny and G2 were heading towards some sort of crossroads. Either Kenny would leave and join another team, or G2 would build a new roster. So G2 did the unthinkable. They brought back legendary in-game leader Existence and Smiths to pair with Shox, Kenny, and Body. It didn't help. Results were awful early on, and Kenny was not activated by Existence like people hoped. It seemed like Kenny had finally cooled off. He was slowing down, whether that was due to age, motivation, or the competition catching up to him. He was still too skilled to be anything worse than good, but calling him just good in any other year would be seen as an insult. In 2018, however, it was reality. One last hurrah for the team was the ever-important ESL Cologne. Amazingly enough, at this stacked event, G2 had their best performance in 4 to 5 months. And not so coincidentally enough, Kenny did too. At Cologne, Kenny was performing at elite levels that we hadn't seen from him in months. It didn't matter what side, what map, or what opponent, Kenny showed up. Unfortunately, it wasn't enough, as G2 once again bombed out early in the playoffs of a big event. This time, Kenny was not to blame. The latter months of 2018 were not much better for Kenny at G2. The lineup never stabilized, and Kenny was performing worse than he ever had in CSGO. To put it into context, in his last 7 events of the year, Kenny had a rating below 1.1 6 times. In the entirety of 2017, he only had 3. Even after the roster change to bring in new blood, G2 was worse than ever before, falling to a historically low 28th rank in the world. This was probably the worst situation Kenny had ever been in, and he would have to overcome adversity to continue his great legacy. The year 2018 was simply put the beginning of the end. The writing was on the wall that Kenny's prime had come and gone. His amazing streak of 5 straight top 20 HLTV appearances had been snapped. He did not win a single trophy or any MVPs. His 1.08 rating for the year was his worst ever, and he was glaringly average on LAN with just a 1.06 rating. His numbers were going down, and with the wealth of other legendary players beginning to phase out of competition, it was hard not to think that Kenny was next on the list. This was the final stretch of Kenny's career. G2 would struggle immensely in 2019, failing to meet expectations in nearly every event. The first half of the year, G2 was still a middle-of-the-pack team being held up by KennyS's monster performances. The problem was that he was no longer as consistent as years prior. For example, at IEM Katowice that year, Kenny was awful, sporting a .97 rating. However, the next event, Kenny had a remarkable WESG finals, with an unthinkable 1.53 rating. Yeah, the competition wasn't the greatest, but still, he put up a rating almost 20 points higher than the next best player. He would continue to have a good stretch of form with 9 straight positive event ratings, albeit with some smaller lands included. The highlight of this stretch of form was ESL Pro League Season 9, where G2 had a Cinderella run of sorts, as on home soil they were able to finish second. Kenny for his part was quite simply a god. He dominated almost all 17 maps he played, with an insane 88% maps with a +1 rating. This included electric games against Heroic, FaZe, and NRG. He would also carry G2 to a competitive final against the Liquid team on their way to a Grand Slam. This was a statement for Kenny. He still had it in there. The second major, Starladder Berlin, was another story. A familiar one for Kenny, as once again he failed at the major. In 9 maps, Kenny spotted a rating under 1 in 4 of them, meaning as an awper he simply wasn't holding his weight. Kenny and G2 were eliminated once again early at the major. This marked the end of the French era for G2, as ownership decided to move in a new direction. For the first time in KennyS's career, he would have to play on an English-speaking team. The transition was not clean, and the second half of 2019 was underwhelming to say the least for Kenny. Unlike the first half, Kenny had wavering consistency, and so did G2. This trend would continue into 2020. G2 would start the year hot, placing second in the year's only LAN, IEM Katowice. Kenny would have an amazing tournament, with a 10-map streak of a +1 rating, only being snapped in the grand finals where he disappeared against Simple and Navi. The CS schedule would switch fully into online play afterwards, and this is where we really started to see the decline of Kenny. In the first 10 events of online, post-COVID play, Kenny would struggle to find his form. He would still have his odd vintage event, like Pro League, where he was the 5th highest rated player, but he would also have numerous mediocre events. He had 9 straight events where he failed to reach a rating over 1.12. Then, G2 completed one of the biggest signings in CS history, signing Nico from FaZe. This move on paper should have given KennyS more space to work with around the map and less weight on his shoulders. However, it did not help at all. As Kenny continued his mediocre run of form for the rest of 2020, the numbers he was putting up would be okay for a lot of players, but for someone who was hailed as one of the best players in CS, it was unacceptable. Simply put, Kenny was lacking effectiveness. In 2020's online era, he had an abysmal 71 ADR as an awper. He also struggled mightily against top 10 opponents, with just a .99 rating. He was finally getting pushed out by CS's new blood, who were thriving in the chaotic online environment. 2021 was Kenny's final year in Tier 1 professional Counter-Strike. He would only play 3 events in that year before being replaced. The writing was on the wall. KennyS's prime was not only over, but it was long forgotten. The problem here was simple. Kenny was playing the same way he was playing in 2015. Aggressive, fast, and unafraid to re-peak. What worked for him 5 years ago was what was causing him to fail now. Overall, KennyS was a Counter-Strike poster boy for many years. You didn't have to play Counter-Strike to know who he was. His opping was the stuff of myths. His peak was one of the highest we will ever see in Counter-Strike history. In a world with godlike talents like Guardian, JW, Device, and Fallen, Kenny was the player who defined the op. He had one of the longest stretches of dominance in Counter-Strike, with him being one of the best players in the game for the better part of 6 years. His early career was plagued by lack of team success and choking in big games, leading to people to wonder if he could actually achieve his lofty expectations. However, a switch to Envy in 2015 led him to finally securing that all-important major trophy. Kenny still to this day has the 4th most MVP trophies in Counter-Strike history, despite not having won one since 2017. Unfortunately for Kenny, his teams always seem to crumble from the inside, and he hadn't had a consistently competent team in the last 4 years of his career. He never won as many trophies as you would think someone of his caliber would. Additionally, he struggled in the majors. Unlike most of the game's legends, he didn't take advantage of the game's biggest stage, as 50% of his majors were below a 1 rating. He was too inconsistent in the majors unlike other greats. His fall-off was one of the hardest to watch, as it was likely accelerated due to the online era. Overall, KennyS gets a career rating of 95 out of 100. He would be a first ballot Hall of Famer without a doubt, and goes down as one of the best to ever do it.